thoughts about the importance of specific forest structures and forest diversity for functioning of the forest, but first of all for human well-being. For centuries, at least during the last centuries, forests were seen primarily as source of material goods like meat, wood, fungi, and so on. But we must realize that in most of the global regions, our ancestors used to live in the forests, and they used to use forests in multiple ways, sometimes in ways which we have lost already. And one of those uses was a healing in the forest. And this approach to the forests is recently brought back to the public by several approaches. One of them is the ecosystem services approach, which divides the services of forests and other ecosystems for provisioning, supportive, regulating, cultural, but consider that in the list, among the things listed under the cultural services, you will not find human health. There's recreation, ecotourism, spiritual values, which of course influence human well-being, but health is not mentioned directly. Little closer to the health is the One Health approach paradigm, which saying straightly, it says our society will be not healthy without healthy environment and healthy animals. And this approach is promoted for the last about 2 decades, as well as the main topic of this webinar, I mean forest bathing, about which I will not say, but what is very specific is that during the last few years, probably due to pandemics of COVID-19, there were published several papers which are stressing quite direct linkages between the forests and human health. I am talking now about the physical health, like the paper published from Italy, where authors reported that the regions which had low afforestation had very high percentage of deaths and a very high percentage of positive tests in Italy, while those regions which had a high afforestation rates had low deaths percentage and low positives. And this effect was not just temporary, it was reported during the 2 consecutive years, so in 2020 and 2021 as well. And this effect was explained, but this is just a hypothesis, it was explained by authors as influence of volatile organic compounds which are released, which are emitted to the air by plants. And when we are walking in the forest, when we are close to the forest, we breathe them in, and they enhance activity of our immunological system. Sorry. Another similar study was published from USA. It's a countrywide study, which also reports strong negative relation between the forest ratio and infection rate. So again, in the afforested areas, the infection rates were much lower than in the areas where forest is not dominating. But what is quite problematic in such studies, studies which are published by medical staff, by psychologists, by sociologists, is that many of such papers treat forests as quite a homogeneous category, without turning attention on the fact that forests are not the same. If you look at the picture here, that's the pine monoculture, and it's absolutely different, and it's building different emotions than, for example, birch monoculture or multi-species forests with complicated structure, with deadwood, with old trees, and so on. So building on this, let's say, weakness of such studies, we developed the special project Dr. Forest, which concentrated on influence of forest ecosystem structure and biodiversity on providing of ecosystem services, and then indirectly on human health and well-being. And from the methodological point of view, we simply measured in several countries in Europe diverse factors, diverse characteristics of the forests which were growing in similar habitat conditions, so on the soils with the similar fertility, similar humidity, but forests were differing from each other by species composition and by a level of diversity, from monocultures up to the 5 species stands. And in such a forest, we measured, for example, the abundance of vectors of diseases like ticks. We measured the amounts of pollens, which could be allergenic. We also measured the diversity and productivity of fungi and several other factors important from the point of view of human health. And now I will present some results of our studies, starting with the quite specific forest structure. I mean the forest disturbance, which in this study we measured by amount of deadwood present in the stands, from the forest which were almost without any dead trees up to the forests which were where trees were completely dead. And what was quite interesting, even for us, that we found that so-called restorativeness decreased with the level of disturbance, but even heavily disturbed forests possess high restorativeness. This difference between the restorativeness of not disturbed and disturbed forest was not significant. And the restorativeness is understood in this study as the ability of landscape, ability of forests to renew personal cognitive capacities and adaptive resources to cope with environmental stressors. We also found that highly disturbed forests enhance diversity of medical plants. On one side, it is of course the side effect of the fact that most of the medical plants are light demanding. So in open forests offer them better conditions to develop, but still the conclusion is that disturbed forests deliver a higher diversity and higher amounts of medical plants for potential use by society. Another factor which we studied is forest diversity, but I will start with the results of the paper, which was not produced in the framework of our project, Dr. Forest, but it's very interesting. It was published from Germany as a countrywide study again. And in this paper, authors found that there is a very significant positive influence of plant and bird diversity on human health. And what's even more surprising and interesting is that when these authors calculated so-called life satisfaction index, they found that it is positively correlated with bird species richness, and it doesn't depend on economic level, on economic richness of the country. In the poorest and in the richest European countries, life satisfaction index increased with the bird species richness. In our studies, we also found that forest diversity is very important. And for example, forests with the high tree diversity are characterized by the lower proportion of thick nymphs, which are infected by Borrelia burgdorferi, so the microbe which causes Lyme disease. So obviously, if we want to avoid ticks, if we want to avoid Lyme disease, we should visit rather forests with a high diversity of trees than monocultures. But part of the forest diversity is also diversity of mushrooms, which are very important diet supplement in many regions of the world. And we found that forests where diversity of mushrooms is higher are characterized also by a higher productivity of mushrooms. So it's an important, again, a signal for people who collect mushrooms to go to such forests. And the species richness of forests increases also quality of mushrooms, as the stands with the higher tree species richness are characterized by a higher content of polyunsaturated fatty acids in mushrooms, which are important for our immunological system, important for functioning of our organisms. Another characteristic of forest, important, which was studied by us, is a forest age. And in this case, we studied how the age of the forest influences the buffering capacity of the forest towards the physiologically equivalent temperature. And here we found that both young and mature forests express these thermal buffering effects. However, it was higher in mature forests, which reduced thermal stress, human thermal stress, more effectively by 12 to 14.5 centigrades, while the young plantations reduced this thermal stress just by 10 centigrades in case of the maximal temperatures. Another important factor which we found influencing human health and well-being is stand density, canopy height, and other characteristic of the stand. And we found that forests with the high canopy height and high canopy closure increase thermal buffering capacity of forests, as well as they increase, unfortunately, abundance of tick nymphs. So in this case, the solution is, if we want to avoid ticks, we should avoid dense forests which are very dark. Excuse me. Another factor, again, which was significant, this is so-called species identity of trees. So the importance of which species of tree is dominating in the forest, or which species is at least present in the forest. And in this case, we found, for example, that strongly shade-casting evergreen species of trees amplify cooling effect of the forest. We also found in another study that some tree species increase frequency of tick larvae. In this case, in the study carried in France, pine forests were those with much higher, significantly higher frequency of tick larvae than oak forests. And in case of the mushrooms, especially of ectomycorrhizal mushrooms, we revealed that European hornbeam, Carpinus betulus, share enhances species richness of ectomycorrhizal mushrooms. I remind you that this species richness of mushrooms is important and enhances productivity of mushrooms. And the last factor which I want to elaborate is the soil chemistry, especially carbon to nitrogen ratio and pH of the soil. And in this case, these two factors of the forest floor enhance species richness of ectomycorrhizal mushrooms, similarly to presence of European hornbeam. So such forests with the high to C2N ratio and high pH of the forest floor would be also productive, but at the same time, pH of the top 10 centimeters of soil decreased species richness of saprotrophic mushrooms. So in this case, we have the same factor which influences two functional groups of mushrooms in opposite way. So depending on our interests, we should pay a special attention for forests with the low or high pH of the soil. And carbon to nitrogen ratio was found to increase content of generally all fatty acids in mushrooms. So again, it increases quality of mushrooms as a supplement of diet. Summarizing, the forest structure and diversity is important to human health and well-being because disturbance, age, species identity, forest diversity, stand density, soil chemistry, probably also some other characteristic influence the elements of forests which directly influence human health and well-being, like thermal comfort, like presence of ticks, like presence of mushrooms and their abundance. The message to take home from my speech is that forests are not equal to each other, and that when we use forests for our health, to increase our well-being, we must take into account that importance of forests for human health depends sometimes on slight differences in stand structure or presence of specific tree species or identity of those tree species.